Hello everyone. Alright, so we've got our choice panel ready, and let's go ahead and code the logic for it. That way we can bring it up on screen and show our choices. So let's go into our core, into the feature panels, right by our input panel. Let's make a new script, and this one's going to be our choice panel. Okay, so for our choice panel, let's make sure that we're using the TM Pro namespace because we want to use that Text Mesh Pro stuff, and we also want to use the Unity Engine UI. Once we've got the UI, we can go ahead and remove update, and we'll make an instance. That way this can be accessed by the logical line that handles the choices. I also want a reference to the canvas group, so that way I can control the alpha, just as well as the title text, so I can set that text on screen. Now, I'm also going to want a reference to that button. Now, the button that we have currently is just going to be kind of like a prefab. It's going to have the reference to it, and then any buttons we need after that are just going to be spawned in. So we can make another serialized field and make this a private game object for the prefab, and this will be the choice button prefab. And when we create the buttons, we're going to want to make sure that they are children of the layout group. So let's add a reference to that as well. Private layout group. And we know that this is going to be a vertical layout group, so I'll just do that and call it the button layout group. Of course, to control the alpha of our canvas group, let's make sure that we create a new canvas group controller. And let's go ahead and make an awake function and just assign our instance. So that way we know the choice panel that is in the scene. The instance will equal the current one in our scene. So in start, let's make our canvas group controller. CG will equal a new canvas group controller using this as the thing to run the coroutine, and we'll pass in our canvas group. And then let's just go ahead and set our alpha, and also set this canvas to not be interactable. At this point, we're using the same logic as the input panel, so we could copy that and just paste it in, or we could go into our canvas group controller and actually make this set canvas state available from the canvas group controller. So let's take a look at that real quick, and all it does is change interactable and blocks raycast. So I'm actually going to cut that from this script, which will give us errors in the input panel. But let's jump into the canvas group controller, come all the way down to the bottom, and just paste it in here. But I'm going to change set canvas state to set interactable state. And then we'll just remove the reference to canvas groups and say root CG as interactable and root CG.blocks raycast, and make this public. So there we are. Now we can call set interactable state, which means it'll be available to both our choice panel and our input panel directly through the canvas group controller. So let's just make sure that we say cg.setInteractable state and just use that from here on out. There we go. I think I may also want a direct ability to set the alpha here, so let's go ahead and make a public float called alpha in our canvas group controller, and we'll go ahead and make a getter, which if we get it, we're going to return root cg.alpha, and if we set the value, then root cg.alpha equals the value that we provide in. So now we can set the alpha directly from our canvas group controller, which means from the input panel, all I can do is just say cg.alpha, which really isn't a necessary step, but it's just another thing that our canvas group controller can now do. I believe that's the only reference to the alpha directly. Looks like it. So now let's go back to our choice panel, and now we can just say cg.alpha equals 0, and cg.setInteractable state will initially be false, so that way we can't interact with the choices when it's not on screen. Now, just like for the input panel, we want a way to show and hide this choice panel. Let's just make two functions for that, for show and hide. And now for show, when we decide to show this input panel on the screen, we want to do two things. We want to show some sort of question that's being asked, and that can be presented in the title. So we want a string for the question, And we also want a list of responses that are available to us. So that could be a string array for choices. And so we'll be able to yield while we're waiting for this player to make their choice. We can go ahead and make ourselves a public boolean called isWaitingOnUserChoice, which we can publicly retrieve but only privately assign from here, and it'll start off as false. So when we show isWaitingOnUserChoice will be true, we are now waiting for that. But when we accept a choice, then we're going to set that to false. So as for what we're going to do when we show this thing, we need to make sure that our CG is made visible. So our canvas group controller needs to become visible and it needs to become interactable. So cg.show will reveal it, and cg.setInteractable to true. That way we can now interact with it. But we are not done here yet, because we have to go through these choices and make sure that we add all of the choices as buttons onto our screen. And we also need to set our title to be the question. So we could say that title text.text equals question, and then we just need to go through and make all of our choices. We're going to come back to that because there's some fancy code that we're going to have to work here. And that's just because we need to set the width and the height for these things and make sure that everything updates in the right order. So we're going to make that into a separate function. For now, let's move on from that and let's take care of the other immediate things that we have to do with this panel. And that'll be when we hide it. So if we decide to hide this panel, all we need to do is make sure our canvas group controller hides itself. And just like input, we need a way to accept the answer that will be made by the player. This will come from clicking the button, but when the button is clicked, it needs to call a function on this panel that tells us that it has accepted an answer. So we can make a private void called acceptAnswer. So let's say we pose the question, how are you today? And we have 4 different choices that we can make. So for each one of these, they need to be able to basically identify themselves and identify themselves to the panel. That way when we click one, it tells the panel that it is the button that's been clicked. We can do this by saving all of our buttons into a list and then referencing them by index. So if we click ecstatic, then we would say accept user input followed by the index of this particular button, which in this case, if fine is 0, ecstatic is going to be 1. Sad would be 2, happy would be 3, so on and so forth. So we're going to need to cache a list of our buttons or a list of our choices, and then each button will correspond to the index of that choice. Which means we're going to want a little bit of data that our choice panel can manage to know what choice is being made and what buttons are available. So let's start with the data that will be collected here. We need to allow a decision to be made from this panel to cache the question and the choices and the answer index that will represent the button that we've clicked. So we'll do this in a class. And we'll make it a public class called, let's say, choice panel decision. That could be our class. And we know that we're going to want a public string for question, which by default will just be string.empty because there's nothing there, and then a public int for the answer index, which would be the index of the choice that we've selected within a buttons list or an array. And we'll just set that to -1 because there's no valid answer yet. And we could also cache our choices. That way, if we get an answer, we may want to look up what the actual text for that answer was. So we can make ourselves a public string array for our choices. And just set that to a new string array with 0 items in it. To make this easy for ourselves to initialize, because we'll create a new decision whenever anything is accepted, or create a blank one at the start of a choice that's being made, we can make ourselves a constructor for the choice panel decision, and take in a question, followed by the string array for our choices, which is exactly what we receive in the show command. So what we can do here is say that this dot question equals question, this dot choices equals choices, and we can just ensure that our answer index equals -1, as we are just starting out and we have no valid answer just yet. So in show, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and make a new cache for our decision. To do that, we need a reference for it up above. So let's make ourselves a public choice panel decision, and we'll call this something like last decision. Anything can get it, so we can reference what decision was made. Only it can assign to itself. And so when we show, let's go ahead and say that last decision equals new choice panel decision, and let's pass in the questions and the choices that have been provided in the show command. So when we create the buttons, they're all going to call accept answer and pass in the index of themselves, whatever has been assigned to those buttons. So we can make that an integer for an index. And we just need to check if our index, well, that went all kinds of wrong. If index is less than 0 for some reason, we know it's invalid, or index is greater than last decision dot choices dot length -1. In other words, if we have an invalid index, then we're just going to return and do nothing, and we are not going to accept that answer. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say last decision dot answer index equals index, and then we'll say is waiting on user choice equals false, and we're going to hide. So that's what happens when we accept the answer. But in order to do that, we need to generate buttons that we can actually prompt to accept an answer. So we have all of our choices inside of this array, and from this array, we're going to create a new button for each one of the choices in it. When we do that, we want a reference to the button itself, so that way we can assign an action for when it's clicked. We also want the text that's a child of it, that way we can set the text of that choice and know what it is we're clicking on. And we also want the layout element that's assigned to that thing, so that way we can set its preferred width and height to match however many lines or whatever there is inside of the text. So to have all of this consolidated into one point, we could make a class or we can make a struct for this, containing those different types that we can assign the values to. So we'll make this a private struct called a choice button. And inside this choice button, we want those three things. We want the public button for the button that we're going to click, public text mesh pro UGUI for the title, and a public layout element. So that way we can resize this thing, and we'll call that layout. So to do this, let's go back up to our show command, and after we've set all of this stuff and we've told the panel to display, we're going to generate all the choices. So let's make this a private void called generate choices, and we're just going to take in all of the choices that have been given to us. So a string array for our choices. After we assign the title text in show, let's go ahead and generate the choices for everything that's been provided to us. So something to keep in mind as we're creating our choices, the text that's a given to each choice can be of varying length, which means the width of our buttons could also change depending on that width. Now, if we have them all set to their own width based on the text that's assigned to them, then we'll get an uneven spacing in our buttons, and maybe that's fine, but what I would like to do instead is unify that width. So by creating all of them and finding the max width of whatever the largest button will be, which would be this one, then I can take that width and assign it to all the buttons. And then they'll all have the same scale, which to me, I think that looks a little bit better. So that's the route I'm going to go. And this just means that as we generate the choices, what we need to do is we need to keep track of a float for our max width. This is the width of the longest button, and in the end of the creation, they all need to be set to this width to maintain that uniformity. And now we simply need to iterate through the choices and create the buttons. As we iterate through our choices, what we can do is we can cache a temporary choice button field, which will be whatever button will be assigned to this particular one. Another thing to keep in mind is potentially coming and making multiple choices available to the user, not in the same session, but making different choices at different times. Some choices may have two choices, such as yes or no, while other ones may have many. So we could wind up creating a varied list of choices, and instead of destroying and recreating them over and over again, which just increases garbage collection in Unity, we could make a cache. And if we already have a choice button assigned to that index, we can simply override it and just change the values of it. But if we're missing a button, then we can go ahead and create it. So if we're going to do that, we need a cache of our buttons. Right up above, let's go ahead and come to, right underneath our canvas group controller, let's make a private list of choice buttons. And this will be our buttons. This is where we'll cache them all at. So as we iterate through this list, let's see if I is less than buttons.count. If it is, then we know we have a button that's already there for this index. So we could say that our choice button is going to be the button at that index. Otherwise, we need to create a new button. And we can do that using our new choice button prefab that we have that will already be there for us. So let's make a game object reference for the new button object and set this to equal instantiate. We're going to make a new choice button prefab, and we're going to parent it to our button layout group.transform. And initially, this button I'm not going to have as like a prefab just set aside in another folder. We're actually going to instantiate it directly from the panel, so it will already exist. It's just going to be disabled in the scene. So I'm going to say that new button object.setActive will be true. So that means our button, this is going to be our prefab, and as we need a new button, we're just going to duplicate it and enable it. Duplicate and enable. And now, since this is a new button, let's get all the information that we need from it. We need the reference to the actual button, which will be the new button, and this is going to be the new button object.get component, and we're going to get the button component off of it. We also want the title. So a text mesh pro UGUI. This will be the new title, is going to be the new button dot get component in children, and we're going to get that text mesh pro object. Then we also need the layout element. So layout element, and this will be new layout equals new button dot get component layout element. So we have everything we need, and now we can create the new struct for our choice button. So choice button, which we have cached above, which will be null at this point, is now going to equal a new choice button, and we're going to initialize it by saying that the button equals our new button, and our title, or okay, I guess our layout, we'll do that one first, equals new layout, and then our title equals new title. And now that we've got that, let's go ahead and add it to our array. So buttons.add, and let's add that new choice button. Let's make ourselves a testing script right now, just so we can see how we're doing. Let's make this choice panel testing. And so we can run it. Let's go ahead and make a reference to our choice panel. So inside of our managers, again, I'm going to make a choice panel manager and assign that choice panel script to it. So we need the canvas group, which would be our choice panel, the title text, which would be the title, the choice button prefab, which is the invisible or deactivated button right now, and the layout group is just the layout group. So the testing script is just going to get that panel, and then we're going to initialize a set of choices that can be used to respond to this question. And we'll show the panel by calling panel.show, providing the question being asked, as well as the choices that we can use in response. Then in Unity, let's make sure choice panel testing is active, and let's give it a whirl and see what happens. Okay, great. So we see our title, and we see we have 4 different choices, And so we've successfully created those 4 different buttons. And now we just need to change the properties of them, including the text and the size. So outside of this if logic, now we know that we have this choice button up here, whether that's one that already existed or one that was just created. So we can assign whatever we need to it now. If it was one that already existed, let's make sure that choice button, let's make sure that choice button, that one, dot button, let's access the on-click event and then remove all listeners. So just in case this is one we're reusing, let's go ahead and just remove any listeners, remove any accept commands from clicking this so we can add a new one. And let's figure out what the index of this button is. We already know that it's going to be the index that we're working with in this loop, and that is I. So that's the index of our button. And now we can say that choice button dot button dot on click dot add listener, and we're going to add accept answer. So we're going to accept the answer, and we're going to pass in the but index. Oh, but we need to make sure that this is the lambda expression, otherwise it's not going to take it. So there we are. And now let's go ahead and assign the text. So choice button dot title dot text equals the choices at the index that we are currently working on. And there we go. We now have the text showing, but you can see that we have a terrible sizing problem. So now let's resize our buttons. Like I said, what I want to do is I want to find the maximum width of our buttons and decide what they should all be sized to. So let's figure out what the size of this button should be. Let's say our float for the button width, it's going to be equal to something. So right now I'm just going to set that to 0 because let's define some default values. Let's make these constants up above. And I want to know the minimum width that any button can be. So we can never go lower than this value. Private constant float for the button min width. And I think I'm going to set that to 50. I don't want it to be any lower than 50. And I also want a max size. So private constant float. And this is going to be the button max size. And I'm just going to set that to 1,000. Next thing, I don't really just want to size it to the length of the text. I want to give it some padding at the end. So I'm going to say private constant float for button width padding will equal something like 25. Okay, so now let's go back down, and when we're calculating this width, what we're going to do is we're going to take our button width, or not our padding, that's going to be the button width padding, and we're going to add that to our choice button dot title dot preferred width. That is the Text Mesh Pro's preferred width that we're going to be looking at. But we want to make sure that this falls in line within our minimum and maximum size. So we'll encapsulate this inside of mathf.clamp. And we're just going to make sure that it never goes any lower than our button minimum width and never any higher than our max size. I should really change that to max width. Okay, great. So we've got the estimated width for this button. And now let's just say that our max width is going to equal mathf.max, and we'll just choose the maximum of 2 numbers. That's going to be, the first one is what is already our max width, or the current button width that we're working with right now. Whichever one's larger is going to become the max width. And that is what we can apply to all of the buttons. Now that all of our buttons are spawned and we know the maximum width that they should all be, let's go through a loop for each of our button in buttons, and let's just set the width of all of them. So we'll say button.layout, and we'll say preferred width equals max width. which means it will find the maximum width of the biggest line and then scale them all to that size. But we can see that the text is actually pretty, it's right on the edges there. So even though I'm using padding, because it's hit the maximum size of the layout group, the text is just maxing out there on the width. So we can change that just by setting the bounds of the text inside of the button. If we look at our choice button in the scene, then we know that we have the button max bounds, and the text is actually sized to the same thing. So let's bring that text in just a little bit. I'm actually going to use the anchors for this. That way I can snap it to it. So we're going to move the anchors inside of the text box, just like so. So we should not go in or outside of those bounds. There we go. And we do get our text showing up in the width there. Now, we are exceeding the vertical bounds here for the one that has multiple lines, but that is because our text is set to be centered, and we are enabling wrapping and overflow as well. If we didn't do that, we didn't enable wrapping, then our text would flow out. If we did not allow overflow, we could truncate, and we can see the actual text rendering area as well inside of our button. So we could leave it like that, you know, and then just have one line for our buttons, or we can enable wrapping. And what we can do instead is we can resize the button to fit the text. So that way we can show multiple lines for choices that will require that. Okay, so we've got our preferred width set, but now we need to make sure that we have as many buttons as we have choices, since we can either get choices that already exist or create new ones, and this may be a choice that we're presented with now that has less choices than a previous one. If that's the case, we'll have more buttons on screen than we do choices, so we need to make sure that any excess ones are disabled, and all of the ones that we need are enabled. So let's do a simple for loop. So for int I equals 0 while I is less than buttons dot count I plus plus. Let's increment and let's see if we are going to show this or not. We're only going to show this if I is less than our choices dot length. If that's the case, we're going to show it. So then let's get the buttons I dot button dot GameObject.setActive to whether we want to show this or not. And then we can also go through each of these buttons that are enabled and make sure that we set their height to something that matches however many lines they're showing. So if show, then let's set the height of this button. So this will be an integer for lines, and it'll be equal to buttons I dot title and text info. We want to get the text info from TextMesh Pro and just get the line count. And then our button or buttons I dot layout dot preferred height is going to equal a certain value multiplied by our lines. We could say maybe 5 times lines. But I'm going to make a value up above just like I did for my width, and this is going to be a private constant float, and this will be the button height per line. And I think I will set that to something like 50. And maybe I'll also add some padding to the top. So private constant float button height padding, and that's going to equal maybe 20. Okay, so let's come back to the bottom here, and we are setting our height. So we're going to set our height to the button height per line times lines, and then just add on the padding to that. There we go. Problem is, if we run that, then we're obviously getting some kind of bad value because all of them are much smaller than their text. So if I run a debug.log and check what that line count is, then what we can see is it is 0 for each one of these lines, so it's not yet updated. What we could do is say buttons I title and force that Text Mesh Pro to update its mesh, and then we get something that's a little more appropriate. But if we look down at those numbers again, we're getting 2 lines on witness, is that a camera, which we are actually only having 1 line rendered there. And this one that has 2 lines says that there are 5 lines for some reason. And the reason for this is, even though we have already set the width of the button, that hasn't actually taken effect until the UI updates. And the UI is updating after our script, so we're actually not getting the correct size for the text. So force mesh update is only going to do so much for us here. We can't actually get the correct line count until the UI updates itself. So the best thing that we can do is actually turn this into a coroutine and then yield between the place where we set the width and the place where we set the height. So let's change generate choices to an IEnumerator. And then right down here, let's just go ahead and extract all of this. Cut that out of there. And after we've disabled the ones that we're not going to do anything with, we will yield return new wait for end of frame. And we're going to wait for the UI to update. And then we'll go for each var button in buttons. We're going to go through each of them. Ah, crap. I just accidentally copied instead of pasting, which means I got to type that stuff out again. So for each button, we're going to get the lines, which will now be updated, and then we'll go ahead and set the preferred height, and that should be good. But that just means that we need to make sure that we call this coroutine. So let's just make sure that we go ahead and start the coroutine for generate choices. And then when we do that, we get the correct number of lines rendering for the size that they are on screen, and everything appears to be good. And so back in the testing script, I'm now going to start a coroutine, which will compile this list of choices, show it on the screen, wait for the choice to be made. Once the choice is made, then I'm going to log the decision that was made based off of the last decision on that panel. So I'll see the answer index, and I'll see the actual question or the response for the question that I just selected. So if all is good, I should be able to click one of these, and I should be able to see the response. So if I click, there we go, made choice number 3, and it is indeed the text of the choice that I made. And if I do that again, but this time choose the second choice, or index 1, then we can see made choice index 1, and oh nah, that was indeed the second choice. So now that I know that's working, I'm going to go ahead and set the alpha to 0 and disable interactable and raycasts on the choice panel. So that way it is out of the way and it is ready to be used. So we've now got the system for our choices up and running, and at this point we can go ahead and integrate that into our dialog file. So that's what we'll do in the next episode. See you guys then.